You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans, the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, I talked with our friend Mike Kofman about the war in Ukraine. These were some preliminary thoughts about the direction of the war, where it's going, and where Ukraine stands. Mike will be fleshing out more of his thoughts pretty soon, both on this show and on the Russia contingency, which is available for War on the Rocks members. And if you want to sign up for that, it's at warontherocks.com/membership.
My first reaction to the interview was that it was quite remarkable. I felt, to be perfectly honest, that Zaluzhny had in that interview said a number of things, or at least the way he described the situation where they were, wasn't too dissimilar to the conversations we've been having on this podcast, Ryan.
Yeah, and things that we get beaten up for saying a lot because we're not sufficiently optimistic about Ukrainian forces. And I guess when the guy commanding Ukrainian forces says it, people stand up and listen a bit more closely.
Well, I honestly felt like an optimist relative to what I read to that interview almost. A lot of the things I read were things that I know I'd been saying and other analysts have been saying about the situation where it was perhaps a bit earlier. But, my main takeaway from it is not a self-validating one. I think that people are largely looking at the same thing. I understand the problem and the issue that's coming next year. Certainly, as we head into a difficult winter, the question is what to do about it. So I think one of the challenges, though, of course, in that writing and in the piece, is always there's some debates and some contradictions, because on the one hand, I felt Zaluzhny saw that air superiority was essential, but also didn't seem to necessarily believe that they'd be able to attain it or that they'd get it to the F-16s, and that he described the situation as a stalemate and that we were going to be entering a period of positional warfare. I think in truth that we've been alternating between periods of positional warfare and attempts at maneuver warfare over the last year and a half. But most folks looking at it agree that next year is probably going to see a lot more positional warfare than not. And he suggested that the way through is technology, but the way to break out of that. But on the other hand, he also suggested that he didn't see a major technological revolution around the corner that would enable this kind of breakthrough. So I myself, just to be clear, reading it, came away with differing impressions depending on what part of the piece you want to focus on. He did identify about 5 key pieces of the puzzle, at least the things he focused on, right? One was air superiority, but maybe not traditional air superiority in the way we think of it with, large platform manned aviation, maybe more with drones and these types of systems. Sort of not as much air superiority, but the utility of various types of ground launch attack drones, FPVs, what have you. Yeah. Second was getting much better at electronic warfare. He described Russians as being quite effective of it and having superiority in EW, but noted that Ukrainians were catching up. Third was getting back to fires and qualitative offsets in fires and I thought that actually more. They can enable maneuver warfare, but also enables you to be much more effective in an attritional fight. And he discussed a lot the benefits that could come from greater precision. And he also discussed the fact that Russians had adapted to it, right? To things like Excalibur munitions that they'd found counters to it and what have you. And I think the last who really spoke to me, which was reserves, getting about the business of addressing both the size and quality of Ukrainian forces. And I think by implication, looking at mobilization issues and the state of the Ukrainian force, that obviously speaks a lot more to me usually than tactics or capabilities. And, to some extent also implied in that were force employment issues, where the way I walked away from that interview and his article is he made very clear that they face a very difficult road to try to break out of what will be perceived as a stalemate, that he takes the Russian military seriously, has a healthy respect for it. He chided people he identified as military analysts without saying who, that were dismissive of Russian military capabilities. I mean, literally in the pieces. Now, I don't know who he was alluding to, but he definitely was pouring cold water over the view that Russians can't get their act together, that their capabilities aren't good and what have you.
And this goes back to our last conversation about how Russia has some industrial advantages that will start coming into play more next year as their capacity and output kicks up. Not as much as I'm sure they would like it to, but enough to keep them in the war. and keep the Ukrainians perhaps on the back foot.
And he highlighted that as well, that unfortunately Russian defense industrial production is yielding increased outputs, and that Ukraine cannot count on the benefits of significantly increased output in the West for maybe another year, which is fair. And he mentioned on air defense maybe too. I might be a bit more optimistic, but I think he's quite right in general on the munitions front that over the course of next year, given the amount of artillery ammunition they need, we're not in a position to resource another offensive like what we saw this summer, right? At a rate of 200 to 250,000 artillery shells per month. That's just not something that we can do. And Zaluzhny is very clear-eyed about the resource constraints in the West and what Ukraine has and doesn't necessarily have to work with. That's my view of it. I think that on the Russian side, the Russian military will still struggle to restore kind of offensive potential, and we're seeing that still right now in their offensive at Avdiivka, and they have a whole host of their own issues to work through. But output's increasing in key categories of munitions, missiles, drones in Russia. They have access to what looks like a substantial amount of artillery ammunition that's coming in from North Korea, probably some unknown amount of ammunition coming in from Iran. There's question marks on whether or not they'll get access to more long-range strike means from Iran or North Korea too. Actually, that's still out there as a possibility. I think probably one of the more near-term challenges on the Ukrainian side are air defense. The good news I see on that front is things like the Frank and Sam project, which after a long time of not yielding results seems to have yielded systems that we can supply, may not be in high numbers that we can produce per month, but will allow us to provide a modified version of a Ukrainian Buck or some other systems that will fire our missiles, our interceptors, right? Because the big issue we talked about previously is that like Ukrainian air defense is Soviet generation air defense, and
running low.
Yeah, after buying up all the missiles available around the world for these types of systems, at the end of the day, there's just a basic structural problem.
Let's talk a little bit about the shape of the battlefield. First, I'd like to start in the south, where there's Ukrainian Marines landed on the other side of the Dnipro River, and they're trying to turn that into a proper beachhead. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think they have a bridgehead and they're trying to move forward. I actually think it's a sizable operation, depending on how it plays out. That they have or at least Russians had long reported they'd known about it, a number of Ukrainian Marine brigades and bridging equipment. And Russian bloggers and other people who follow this had been talking about those concentrations for some time before the operation really got underway. I mean, it's probably one of the more significant efforts right now that Ukraine has ongoing. The offensive in the south, writ large in Zaporizhia and the one on the Yukon-Vasilka axis seems to have culminated.
Yeah, nothing much new happening on those axes right now.
I mean, they're still fighting there, to be clear, but there isn't much of anything that could be described as a push at this stage. And I suspect we won't see one. Beyond that, I think at Bakhmut, fighting continues, but without significant amounts of progress. I think a lot of focus now is down in Kherson and this attempt to secure a bridgehead, although it's rather difficult because Ukraine would have to resupply a significant amount of forces across the river, and they'd have to move significant amounts of equipment to gain momentum off of the foothold that they have.
It's quite difficult, wet, marshy terrain.
Yeah, it's a mix. I'll put it this way. I think it's a high-risk, high-reward operation. Okay, that's the way I look at it. And we'll see how it progresses. But the big challenge that this operation has is there's no major vector of attack at this point that I can see from Orikhiv to marry it up to. Meaning, if Russian forces aren't substantially pressured south of Orikhiv, then they can begin to shift their focus to Kherson, right? And what's happening there. And of course, the other main fight is the Russian ongoing offensive around Avdiivka, and recently some attacks in the general Vuhledar area again.
Russia has sustained that attack, but it's still not going very well for them.
Yeah, they've lost quite a bit of equipment. In fact, it's fair to say that they probably lost as many armored fighting vehicles fighting there since around October 10th. So probably it's been, about 3 weeks or so, as Ukrainians had in several months of fighting down south by Robotyne. And they haven't made much progress. I mean, we're talking gains of hundreds of meters, and Ukrainians have been counterattacking the Russian positions as well. And as we discussed before, Avdiivka was sort of a natural salient, and Russians were trying to close it in an operational double envelopment. Of course, the issue they had is they also ran into a well-prepared defense, although they were operating at some scale, meaning battalion-sized formations coordinated with artillery, some air support. But it showed the difficulty of trying, even if you could put the pieces together, of trying to punch through a very well-prepared and organized defense. So Ukrainian positions have overall held. But it could become a prolonged attritional battle.
It's almost been like a mirror image in some ways of Ukraine's offensive, although Russia conducted it quite differently, accepted a lot more losses, as we previously discussed.
Yeah, I've sort of remarked on occasion or quipped that if you look at the Russian attempt to encircle Ukrainian forces at Avdiivka in the south and the north, it kind of looked a bit like what it seemed the U.S. and other folks were proposing for Ukraine to do down south, a much larger mechanized push, take the casualties and the losses to try to achieve a breakthrough. And the problem with that thesis, well, without going back on a subject, right, it might, I don't know if it will work or not, but the point being is that it shows you that even if you try to push through the casualties and you're willing to sacrifice a lot of equipment and a lot of lives, the way the Russian military is in this operation, it's no recipe or guarantee of success.
You might still only gain a few hundred yards, and then,
Hey everyone, I want to take a quick break from my conversation with Mike to introduce you to Thinking the Unthinkable, one of our newest members-only podcasts hosted by Ankit Panda, and it's focused on the third nuclear age. On this week's episode, Ankit sat down with Mike for a conversation on Russian nuclear doctrine and the risks of nuclear escalation.
So a question that I often get from journalists about nuclear use in Ukraine is, at what point do you begin to worry? Because I agree with you generally that, while the risk of nuclear use went up on February 23rd last year, it's basically been in the same ballpark throughout the conflict. And the thing I say is basically alluding to what you just said. I mean, if we saw evidence of warheads being moved out of central storage, I might take that as a more serious signal. I think the United States would observe that, given the experience we have with the Russians in arms control with our NTM. What for you is the thing that would kind of make you sit up and say something has meaningfully changed when it comes to the risk of nuclear use?
A cascade collapse of Russian forces in Ukraine, such that they've lost cohesion and effective command and control. So
the decimation of the Black Sea Fleet, does that come up to that level, do you think? Or
no, I don't think so. And I just think that a lot of these, not only have a lot of these things simply not happened, but we're now quite far away from them. Right? Like, this was a consideration people had last fall when Russian forces routed in Kharkiv. But the rout in Kharkiv had concrete reasons behind it, and it didn't spread to the rest of Russian forces. And the withdrawal from Kherson was a rather orderly, well-organized withdrawal overall. And we've just not seen, after Kharkiv, or even before Kharkiv, significant routes of Russian forces or contagion, right? This kind of what people had hoped, that there'd be a degree of contagion if there was a defeat of the Russian force on one part of the front. So ultimately, I think we're now quite far away from it, from those conditions.
Fair enough.
If you want to hear the rest of this show, join our tribe by heading over to warintherocks.com/membership today. Now back to my conversation with Mike Kofman.
So, Mike, I know you're probably going to do a proper post-mortem of the Ukrainian offensive on the Russia contingency, but I'd like to look, beyond that, beyond this winter and into next year, midwinter next year, going forward. What are some of the ways you see the war shaping up into next year?
I think a pessimistic outlook would be that next year is more of a gap year, meaning that, as Illusion describes, neither side is able to break out of positional warfare. We have attritional fight. Ukrainians and others are right to say that they're not necessarily favored in an attritional fight against Russia, given the balance of resources, and that's true. And the fact that Ukraine is much more conscious about saving its people and can't afford to be callous with them. And so you could see that, look, the situation will still be dynamic. There will probably be increased emphasis on strike campaigns between Russia and Ukraine, and both sides going after each other's critical infrastructure. You could see Ukraine attempting to focus pressure on Crimea, seeing that as the one thing they can potentially touch in effect, and trying to claw back more and more sea control in the northwest part of the Black Sea, regaining maritime access to Odessa. I think, a more positive view of it is to see it as a build year for 2025, where Ukraine can focus on reconstitution, we can solve a lot of issues in training and expand it. Ukraine can rationalize the different systems and platforms it has, logistics, maintenance, supply. We can localize a lot more of the maintenance and parts production in Ukraine. Ukraine can
Fix some of the training problems and training pipeline problems.
Absolutely. We can work with them, help them get brigades off the line that haven't been properly rotated, begin reconstituting them. We can also, most importantly, engage in a training pipeline that's not a crash effort where we're trying to create brigades in 4 months and we don't have the time to develop unit cohesion, brigade staff training, but actually take the time to do it and to see if we can get the Ukrainian military to be able to employ forces at scale.
But if Ukraine uses next year in that manner and its backers, including the United States, what's stopping Russia from also using that year for the same purpose?
We'll stop Russia, I think, and not stop, but say will negatively impact Russia's ability to do that is Russia, which is that they're going to keep being on the attack and trying to take the Donbass. And everything they've shown suggests that they're happy to throw away equipment, men, what have you, in this pursuit. I'm not saying that, here's my view. I'm not saying that Russia won't do it also. They will, but it's easier to defend than to attack. The challenge that Ukraine has is there's a real dilemma. First, Ukrainian forces have to, or they see as an imperative, to pressure the Russian military. So they feel they have to impose some degree of attrition. How do you do that without exhausting your own men, without spending your ammunition, and be able to do reconstitution as well? And I realize that there's a big tension between those goals. This is the first issue I see. The second one is that here the military rationale strategy cuts a bit against the political objectives, which is Ukrainian political leadership, as I interpret, wants to maintain the optics that they have the initiative, and they likely believe that what doesn't grow begins to rot, right? So that they need to keep making gains. Okay, to do that, you have to expand ammunition, you have to expand your own manpower to maintain this kind of pressure and to show that there's some progress, that it's not a stalemate or that Ukraine isn't losing. All right, it's hard to do everything at the same time. Strategy is about choices. Yeah, if you try to do everything at the same time, usually you basically do a poor job of all of those things. So my sense is that Ukraine and we as well have some hard choices to make for next year. Is that going to be a build year? In which case the focus is going to have to be on defense and strike capabilities and maybe conduct some campaigns, but not others. Or is that going to be a year where Ukraine is going to still focus on trying to pressure Russian forces, prevent Russian reconstitution, but obviously at a cost expense to itself? And how will they balance the political imperatives, like the need to maintain a certain perception of the war, with the military ones?
Yeah, I mean, what to me, what Zaluzhny's article and interviews show, I mean, obviously these things have been communicated between Kyiv and Washington behind closed doors before. It's not like we're learning something new. It's just remarkable to hear him say it and see him say it in print. But what I worry about is this really shows, and we alluded to this in the last episode, that NATO and Washington's promises and statements that our policy is to support the complete victory of Ukraine have either been hollow or insincere maybe, or, more charitably perhaps, just a failure. Because right now we're not doing, and we haven't been doing, what Ukraine would need to actually do that. And of course, this isn't all on us. Ukraine has its own struggles that are independent from what we can do for them. But it really shows that Washington really needs to be thinking through how to either adjust its policy or resource its policy better.
I think one challenge I see is that we need to articulate a plan. This was the thrust of my piece Beyond the Offensive with Rob Lee in May, right, in Foreign Affairs, basically saying that no matter what happens in the offensive, we're going to need a real post-offensive plan, a strategy for a long war, and a protracted war. I've been talking about a protracted war for a while. Nobody wanted to hear this, Ryan, if you remember. And now we're in a place where you have to read it from Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief, who very clearly signaling that it's a protracted war, maybe a stalemate for some time. But I think the challenge we definitely have is gaining clear alignment, where we are with resources, what is the art of the possible for next year. Second, what are we going to be doing with next year? Like I said, pessimistically, if we don't have a plan, or a plan isn't well aligned with the Ukrainian vision, then it's going to be almost a gap year. It's going to be a harder year than this year. I hope that's not what happens. It could be a build year that builds towards something, but we have to articulate towards what.
Yes.
What does that look like? What's our strategy? How does that marry up with the Ukrainian vision? And
And how do we get Germany to show up properly, as we discussed in the last episode?
And how do we get Europeans to, if it's a build year, how do we get Europeans to actually build? I know they're working on it, but how do we get them to actually show up with the things they said they're going to do?
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode. Don't forget to check out our membership program at warntherocks.com/membership. We have some pretty exciting episodes of Mike's show, The Russia Contingency, coming up around the corner, so very much recommend you become a member so you can hear those. Can't tell you much more about them, but I promise you'll like them.